Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Kylie Burke, and I'm the co-founder of Noni Educational Solutions. Prior to starting Noni, I spent many years as an early ed company called Teaching Strategies. Some of you may know it. Oh my gosh, can I start over? I'm sorry, I'm going to start over. I promise that'll be the last time I do this. Okay. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining me today. My name is Kylie Burke. I'm the co-founder of Noni Educational Solutions. Prior to starting Noni, I spent many years at an early ed company called Teaching Strategies. There, I had the pleasure of being an author of all of the editions of the creative curriculum and the gold assessment system. So some of you may have heard of those tools before. I've also been a teacher, a school administrator in elementary schools, in pre-K programs, and in preschools. I am so glad to be able to talk to you about this topic today. I want to start off, first of all, by saying that talking about trauma and ACEs can be a really difficult one to tackle, and it can bring up a lot of feelings about our own experiences and our own childhoods, and about the challenges that we've helped the children we care for and their families face. So I just ask that you tune into yourself a little bit, and if you need to step away or take a deep breath or reach out for some support in the chat, please do what you need to take care of yourself. You know, one of the challenges that surrounds dealing with trauma and ACEs is the secrecy that often accompanies it. You know, many of us were taught not to talk about stuff like this, not to share our personal family business. So I am so grateful to people like Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, you know, all of these folks who are bringing discussions about trauma into the mainstream in order to address what pediatricians and the CDC have referred to as an epidemic of trauma, a public health crisis of adverse childhood experiences. We have to be able to talk about it. We need to understand it and its impact on development and learning and what we can do to help. You know, those of us who work with young children and their families have certainly felt its impact in our classroom for years. So let's start off with some baseline definitions. In the late 90s, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti led a research project between the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Preventative Medicine at Kaiser Permanente in my new hometown of San Diego. They were exploring the relationship between people's early emotional experiences in childhood and their subsequent mental and physical health outcomes. This truly groundbreaking research at the time revealed a strong relationship between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and adult health. And even more significant, their research showed that ACEs were way more prevalent than anyone had previously thought. These were the original 10 adverse experiences that were used in that research study. Since then, the medical field has largely agreed through ongoing research that that list isn't complete and should include other factors like the deployment of a family member in the military, or victimization, bullying, or discrimination, loss of a caregiver due to deportation. Even though the initial research only included those first 10 ACEs, it's unreal to consider the results. They collected data from 17,000 adults, all insured by Kaiser. And while racially and culturally diverse, economically, they averaged out to be pretty solidly middle class. And we'll circle back to why that's notable in a bit. Anyway, they tallied how many ACEs each person experienced and assigned them with a score. Each ACE has a value of 1. If you had no ACEs, your score was a 0. If you experienced all of that first column, you could score a 10. Over half of the participants had experienced 1 or more ACE. 25% had multiple ACEs, and 1 out of every 16 people had experienced 4 or more. Until this study, many people held the belief that trauma happens in communities impacted by poverty. And while research has since shown that living in poverty increases the likelihood of ACEs exposure, poverty itself is not an ACE. Adversity does not discriminate. Trauma is everyone's problem. Bad things happen to children across all races, religions, socioeconomic levels, and family structures. That has been made even more clear during these past 18 months. Lots of studies since have replicated the findings, actually, in several instances, getting as high as 90% of participants experiencing one or more ACEs. Getting at the actual number can be pretty tricky since it's self-reported. And like I said at the beginning, many of us were brought up being told that you don't talk about this, right? Talking about our childhood trauma is a cultural taboo. You don't do it. You don't share your personal, private family business. Unfortunately, that notion is stopping some folks from getting the help that they need. And it's why I now am so open about sharing my personal story. If you have any interest, you can read about it on our website, nonieeducationalsolutions.com. But when I look at this screen, I can tell you that my ACE score is 4. My brother's was a 7. His first 3 years of life before I was born were pretty rough. So when you look at this screen, what do you see reflected about your life? Doing some self-reflection is critical if we want to be able to show up and be our best selves for the children and family we serve. So today, we're going to use the term trauma pretty interchangeably with ACEs. So when we say it, what we mean is an exceptional experience in which powerful events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. So it's important to note that trauma is highly individualized. What overwhelms my capacity to cope may be very different from yours. We won't spend a ton of time diving into all of the science today, but we do have to have a working understanding of what happens to the body when trauma occurs. What makes ACEs have such big and long-term consequences on our health and well-being is because of what happens to the body during our natural response to stress. So if you'll bear with me, I'll try to keep it brief. The amygdala is the brain's fear center. It helps you identify and react to threats in the environment. The classic example that's used is the bear. Your body has developed and needs the emotion of fear to help save you from that bear in the woods. So you see the bear, the amygdala sounds the alarm to be afraid. Your brain then triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response. Signals are sent from the brain to the adrenal glands, telling them to make adrenaline, right? Adrenaline causes your heart to beat faster and stronger. So your blood is pumping, your blood pressure rises, your body is ready for action. You get amped up, you're on high alert. Your blood's flowing, heart's pumping, muscles are primed and ready to go. What you don't want to do in this moment is stop and think. There is a bear in front of you. So your fear center temporarily shuts down the thinking part of your brain, the part of your brain responsible for executive function. At the same time, your brain sends signals that result in the release of longer-term stress hormones, or cortisol. After all, you may need to adapt to a continued threat. Your body doesn't know if you're now going to have to live in this situation with bears all around you. So this helps prepare your body for that. Some of the effects of cortisol are similar to adrenaline. It raises your blood pressure and blood sugar. It interrupts healthy emotional regulation. It inhibits your ability to think clearly, and it messes up your sleep cycle. It also triggers your body to crave high sugar, high fat foods. Your body will need energy after all if you've got to fight that bear over and over again. For me, this was like a big aha learning moment that helped me understand why I have been eating bread and ice cream through this pandemic. It's my body craving those foods as a natural stress response. And one more great, amazing thing that your body does in response to stress is your immune system gets activated, bringing inflammation to be able to help stabilize the body in case you end up fighting that bear and you get hurt. Your body is ready. So, if we take all of that within the context of seeing a bear during a hike in the woods, this is awesome and amazing that our bodies can do this. A healthy stress response has kept humans alive for centuries. The problem is when this happens too frequently, or if the stressor is too intense, the body can lose the ability to shut this process down. Well, we have to mention that not all stress is bad stress, right? We've got 3 different types of stress responses. The first is a positive stress response. It's normal, it's essential, it's part of healthy development. You get a brief increase in heart rate, elevated hormone levels, but it all comes back to normal. It all regulates itself. There's a tolerable stress response in which the body's alert system has been activated to a greater degree. This is as a result of a more severe or serious stressor, or a stressor that's perhaps a little longer lasting. Activation, however, is time limited and it's buffered by a nurturing relationship. And then there's the toxic stress response, and this is where we get into trouble. This is strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity without, and for children, adequate adult support. This actually disrupts the development of the brain architecture and our bodily systems. When the amygdala is repeatedly triggered, it can do 2 things. It can have an exaggerated response to stimulus, so it overreacts to even small stressors, treating everything like it's a bear. And it can start to send false alarms, getting confused about what is a threat and what is literally nothing at all. In other parts of the brain, in your locus coeruleus, it can cause anxiety and arousal and aggression. It interrupts the sleep-wake cycle. In the prefrontal cortex, this is the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, making smart decisions, the executive function control center. It can cause an inability to concentrate and solve problems. Impulsive behavior and aggression can be seen. In the hippocampus, it can make it difficult to create both short-term and long-term memories. Those are 2 things you have to be able to do to learn anything at all. And in the VTA, this is the part of the brain responsible for rewards, motivation, and addiction. You have a dysregulated sensitivity of dopamine receptors. The ACE study shows that there's a dose-response relationship between exposure to early adversity and using substances that activate the VTA. A person with 4 or more ACEs is 2.5 times as likely to smoke, 5.5 times as likely to be dependent on alcohol, and 10 times as likely to use intravenous drugs as a person with 0 ACEs. The original ACEs study and follow-up studies since have shown this link between ACEs and all of these diseases and conditions, chronic diseases like autoimmune disease, cancer, heart disease, liver disease. It shows links between alcohol and drug abuse, links with depression and suicide, risky sexual behaviors, violence. You can see why folks refer to this as a public health crisis. High doses of childhood adversity not only affect the brain structure and function, but also the developing immune system and hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. I mean, there's so much more science we could talk about how ACEs impact the body. But let's start diving into how this impacts children in our classrooms. So we know that over 2/3 of children report having experienced at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. Over 50% of children ages 2 to 5 years old have experienced a severe stressor in their lifetime. And we know that those numbers are only going to get higher following the pandemic. And like we just talked about, exposure to adverse childhood events can have long-term, wide-ranging impacts on children's physical health and mental health. Children who've been exposed to ACEs are more likely to be chronically absent. They're more likely to be diagnosed with learning and behavior problems, and more likely to be suspended and expelled from school. And we know that children who've been suspended and expelled from school are more likely to later drop out of high school and become incarcerated. When children are exposed to trauma, their brains are in stress response mode. They're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. This makes it difficult for children to focus on learning, if not impossible. And long-term exposure to those stress chemicals actually damage the architecture of the developing brain. In the early 90s, before the original ACEs study was released, there was this emergency room doctor in Kansas City who saw an article in the local newspaper that profiled all of the young people in the city who had been killed by gunshot wounds. As she looked through at the pictures of the victims, she recognized many of them as her patients over the years. And she wondered, was there something that she could have done to help them, to save them from this awful fate? So she decided to do this comprehensive chart review of all the pediatric firearm injuries in Kansas City for that year, looking for any commonalities, anything that could be preventable. What she discovered was this incredibly tragic and common pattern that went something like this. So a patient comes in as a baby with a suspicious bruise, and the case is referred to Child Protective Services. The investigation is inconclusive. The next notation in his chart is from the pediatrician describing some missed vaccination appointments. At age 4, his chart notes that his preschool teacher says that he won't sit still, he has frequent tantrums, and he hits the other kids. He's diagnosed with ADHD, and he's put on meds. At age 10, he's fighting and disruptive in school. This time, he's diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and put on more meds. At age 14, he comes to the ER with a broken bone in his hand that doctors call a boxer's fracture, because it's the bone that typically breaks when you punch something. The final entry in his medical record is at 16 when he's brought to the ER with multiple gunshot wounds. There are so many studies like this one that highlight the tragic impact of ACEs. This one was one that was profiled in Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's book, The Deepest Well. There's been this long-standing, really commonly held myth that children are these naturally incredibly resilient beings. We say things like, oh, that's okay, the kids will bounce back, they're fine, kids are resilient. It turns out that that is perfectly wrong. Children are not superhuman. They are vulnerable. While their brains and bodily systems are still developing, they're more vulnerable to the impact of toxic stress than adults are. You know, if we think back to the science of all of the physiological processes that are taking place during stress, your body is activating and shutting down certain parts of your brain, deliberately strengthening some neural pathways and weakening others. So think about the tremendous impact that has on young children whose brains are still developing, when the architecture of their brains is still being built. The neural pathways telling them to be on high alert, to be hypervigilant, ready for a fight, ready to run, ready to shut down, retreat, protect themselves. Those neural pathways are being strengthened. And the ones related to problem solving, to emotional regulation, to human connection, to impulse control, those are weakening. Now, Dr. Burke-Harris did a chart review of all of her patients at the Bayview Clinic, the average age of children in her study being just 8 years old, and the results were remarkable. Children with 4 or more ACEs were twice as likely to be overweight or obese, and 32.6 times as likely to have been diagnosed with learning and behavior problems than children with 0 ACEs. So what does that mean for us? Children who've been exposed to trauma, they're more likely to exhibit behaviors that challenge us as teachers and as caregivers. And in these moments of heightened stress, we aren't always able to respond in ways that align with our goals for children. Because educators, we are more likely to have been impacted by ACEs ourselves. So working with children who've been impacted by trauma and ACEs can trigger us, those of us who've experienced our own trauma. We may already be overwhelmed by stress just from our daily responsibilities. This can leave us feeling frustrated and isolated and upset by these challenges. Children suffering the effects of trauma are not in learning mode. They are in stress response mode. And if you take nothing else from this 45 minutes together, please take that with you. So what does that look like in a classroom? What does stress response mode look like? It looks like withdrawing, fleeing, skipping class, daydreaming, seeming to sleep, avoiding people, wandering. It looks like acting out, being overly silly, the class clown, exhibiting defiance, being hyperactive, behaving aggressively, arguing, yelling. It looks like numbness, a refusal to answer, refusing to get needs met, giving a blank look. Trauma has a disorganizing and detrimental effect on children's learning and development. Children who've been negatively impacted by trauma, their bodies have lost the ability to appropriately manage their stress response. And early on, children identify ways of managing their stress, healthy or not. And those coping methods become patterns of behavior. I can think of children who I've taught. Casey, whose parents went through a contentious divorce with months of frightening screaming matches in his home. His sensitized stress response presented with behaviors like flipping over tables, knocking down chairs, and running out of the classroom. Georgia, whose chaotic and unpredictable home environment led her to develop the adaptive behavior of completely shutting down, zoning out during any classroom transition. So she'd miss directions and was perpetually confused about what was happening. Joseph, whose young mother died of a drug overdose when he was 4 and left Joseph in the care of a father he'd never met before. He'd hide food in his cubby, sneak discarded leftovers out of the classroom trash can, and who would alternate from being the class clown to being completely silent and seemingly lost in his thoughts. Children end up in a cycle of dysregulation. They experience ACEs, so they exhibit dysregulated behaviors because of a dysregulated stress response. And as adults, we respond poorly to those behaviors. That damages our relationship with the child, which leads to further dysregulated behaviors. Important to note that children who've experienced trauma and adverse childhood experiences, they're more vulnerable to experience what some folks call trauma with a little t at school and in the community and in their relationships with others. These include things like poor relationships with teachers, being met with low academic expectations, getting in fights, being removed from class, being stigmatized for their behaviors, failure to form healthy friendships or partnerships. So while these may not be the big kinds of trauma like the death of a parent or being abused or witnessing violence in your community or having prolonged food insecurity, those traumas with a little t, they continue to reinforce unhealthy behavior patterns, impact how children see themselves as learners, and exacerbate the negative impact of ACEs. Young children are the most vulnerable to adversity. But the good news, and there is good news here, folks, they also have the greatest capacity for healing when interventions are begun early. So what are those mitigating factors? Well, we can start with the physical ones, right? So getting enough sleep, we know this, eating a healthy diet, exercising, practicing mindfulness. Those are really key mitigating factors. And these are really important to us, for those of us as adults who are looking back at our own trauma and ACEs. These four things are really key. But the most important mitigating factor are secure, trusting, nurturing relationships. The greatest chance of buffering against a child and the long-term negative impact of ACEs are secure, trusting, nurturing relationships. In the work I'm doing now with Noni, we have formed a partnership with an organization called the Laurie Center that's really leading the way in trauma-informed, relationship-centered teaching, caregiving, and research. They were founded by who we might call the fathers of childhood mental health and wellness, Dr. T. Barry Brazelton, Dr. Stanley Greenspan, and Dr. Reginald S. Laurie. And the Laurie Center serves children and families who've otherwise been excluded from mainstream programs. So all of these children are presenting with a dysregulated stress response that creates those dysregulated behaviors that has caused this exclusion. They have this tremendously successful track record of academic and social gains, reduced suspension and expulsion rates as children re-enter mainstream school. They have an 80% success rate coming out of their preschool program and transitioning to public school kindergarten. And core to the Laurie Center's practice is this idea of relationship-centered teaching and caregiving. They are reflective practitioners. They're constantly reflecting in the way that they talk to children, reflecting on the practices that worked and didn't work, reflecting on their own progression as teachers. They practice consistent self-care. They have a sustainable practice, and they support each other with practitioner self-care. And they are careful, keen observers of children's behavior. And all of this is grounded in attachment theory. And really, if we think about attachment theory, that is relationship-centered caregiving, having that trusting, nurturing relationship. Having this focus on relationships acts as that buffer between the child and the negative impact of trauma. But it also helps teachers and caregivers have a more well-rounded view of a child. We call that in Noni having a balanced profile. It helps teachers and caregivers understand the function of behavior. It shifts interactions from control to influence. It challenges implicit biases we may have as teachers, shifts the power over dynamic. It supports teachers and caregivers to have higher expectations for performance. When you have a relationship with someone, you expect more for them. You want more for them. It creates a climate conducive to learning and allows for more individualized teaching and caregiving. So what's getting in the way of relationships now? We know that dysregulated behaviors are the primary cause of dysregulation in relationships. So if we recall this cycle of dysregulation, the child experiences ACEs, has a dysregulated stress response, exhibits dysregulated behaviors. Adults respond ways that are in conflict with their goals for children, sometimes in ways that re-traumatize children, which further damages the relationship, which leads to more dysregulated behaviors. In Noni, we focus on 30 categories of dysregulated behaviors. I know that that's a lot, and many of these have multiple facets to them. Things like physical aggression, which can be directed at adults, it could be directed at peers, yelling hurtful words or obscenities at no one or directed at a person, zoning out, elopement, that's leaving the classroom or leaving a supervised area, defying safety rules, excessive demonstrative behavior. So this is like we're being the class clown, or behaving in a way that we'd otherwise call like hyperactive, having a mobilizing anxiety, damaging things in the environment, having a negative self-image, struggling with personal space challenges. There's about 30 different categories of ways that dysregulation can present itself. To break the cycle of dysregulation, we need to build the relationship and create a buffer between the child and the negative impacts of early adversity. There are 6 components of a relationship-centered response, and we'll just go through these quickly and look at an example. There's an immediate response, being able to identify the function, which leads to your intervention and prevention strategies. Rupture repair strategies, which work to mend a relationship. There's the piece of the response that's really important, and that's how we communicate about it with families. And then there's always special considerations anytime we consider dysregulated behaviors. So we'll use yelling hurtful words or obscenities as an example. So this is can be a classic fight response meant to accomplish verbally hurting other people, convincing people to back away. It can be self-protective. It can be an uncontrollable outpouring of emotion. It can be used as a means of avoidance. It can be used as a way to express pain or upset in a way that gets maximum attention. Young children learn quickly that telling an adult to F off does yield maximum attention. So it can be a way to get noticed. It can be a way to cause disruption. So there are lots of reasons why a child might choose this particular dysregulated behavior or engage in this particular dysregulated behavior. So our goal is to de-escalate and regulate, and that is always our primary goal of any immediate response is to dysregulation is de-escalation. So remember what we know about the stress response, right? Our body is preparing for a fight or to run away from a threat or to go inward into freeze mode. The thinking part of your brain shuts down. This is why it is very difficult to get through to someone or to connect with someone who's dysregulated. It is nearly impossible to reason with someone who cannot access the reasoning part of their brain. So what should we do? First of all, we should stay regulated, take a couple of deep breaths, ground ourselves in the earth so we can stay present and connected to the thinking part of our brains. If we can stay regulated and calm, it's more likely that the child will eventually mirror our calm behavior. If there's a safety risk, we have to intervene immediately to ensure safety is necessary. Then we use reflective active listening, simply repeating back what you hear the child expressing through words and actions. And then we support their return to regulation. So we consider what we know about what calms the child down, their sensitivity to touch, whether they need physical distance from you, or if they're a child who needs you to be close. If the child needs your support to calm themselves and appears ready to receive your guidance, you can get on their eye level and again reflect your understanding of their feelings. You seem really frustrated. We can coach them to use a calm down strategy that's appropriate, one that we've introduced them to in the past, taking some deep breaths, moving their body rhythmically, or some other mindfulness strategy that we've practiced. When a child displays dysregulated behavior, they are not in the state of mind to learn. So attempting to teach a child during dysregulated behavior will not lead to behavior improvements because their brain isn't able to take in new information at that moment. In a heightened moment of stress, teachers will often want to say to students, the rule is we stay in the classroom, or the rule is we sit in our seats. The rule is we have to keep our hands to ourselves, right? While it may be fine to state the rule and expectation at the moment, you will have to repeat them after the child has returned to a regulated state. It's not until the child is regulated that we can begin the work to teach new skills and replacement behaviors. So when we think about this with the yelling hurtful words and obscenities directed at someone, right, we're going to take a deep breath. We're going to use active listening to reflect back our understanding of their feelings. You seem really angry that it's cleanup time. We're going to continue that active listening without acknowledging the inappropriate language. We can use comments of care. Comments of care is a lovely one where we just express how much we care and how much we want to help them in that moment. Just keep repeating those and using our active listening. And then we're going to identify the function. So all behavior has a reason. Was the child seeking attention? Were they telling you to back off or give them some space? Were the words said in anger? or were they set in fear, right? So identifying the function is really key to be able to apply our intervention and prevention strategies. These are based on that identified function of the behavior, and these are the teaching opportunity with the child when they are regulated. So this is at a different time from the dysregulated behavior. It's your opportunity to teach new skills and replacement behaviors. Another important component of a relationship-centered response is the rupture repair strategy. So when dysregulated behaviors occur in the classroom, healthy relationships can be interrupted, they can be damaged or ruptured. So it's important in relationship-centered teaching to make the conscious effort to repair the rupture. So anytime a child exhibits dysregulation, keep in mind, what are you going to do to repair that rupture? It may only require a small, kind, or loving gesture on your part later in the day, a pat on the shoulder, some moments of undivided positive attention, or a brief calming activity you can do together. Some situations like dysregulation that leads to conflicts between children, that might require a more complex rupture repair strategy that involves repairing the relationship between the children. In a situation where your stress response overwhelmed your ability to respond calmly to the child's dysregulated state, it's even more important to attend to this rupture repair strategy. When sharing information with families, it's important to communicate with empathy and take a balanced approach, right? I mean, chances are families already know that their child struggles to consistently regulate their emotions or their behaviors because they are challenged by the same things at home. And this can cause a lot of stress in a family, which may be compounded by stress that the family is already experiencing separate from their child. So take a moment, put yourself in the family's shoes before you communicate and ask yourself, have I done the work that I need to build a relationship with this family so they see me as a trusted resource? How will they best receive this information? And will sharing this information help the child and strengthen the family relationship? And that's a really important one to be able to ask. For all dysregulated behaviors, there are special considerations. Sometimes those considerations are related to trauma and ACEs. Sometimes they're related to our own self-care. Sometimes children provide insights to us that then will prompt that we'll need to seek outside help, additional resources. With NONI, we have brought together the key elements of relationship-centered, trauma-sensitive teaching, relationship-focused whole class strategies, support for individual students, those intervention and prevention plans related to all of those dysregulated behaviors, a means of monitoring those over time and providing individualized support for children, professional learning opportunities in the form of videos, podcasts, reading materials, and support for helping teachers create a sustainable self-care practice and support and resources for families. So in the handouts for this session, I've included some of those teaching practices and some of the self-care practices that you can use right away. I do implore you to think about, particularly this school year, how are you going to take care of yourself? How are you going to treat yourself with kindness? How will you manage your stress response? Because self-care is more important and more critical than ever, particularly in doing this work with children and families. I love this quote. The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. That goes for adults and children alike. Relationships are the most powerful teaching tool we have, and yet they often get sidelined for curriculum implementation, for that important content learning, that those goals that we have to meet. However, we know from the research that when children are in stress response mode, they're not in learning mode. We cannot expect a child to attend to a group discussion, to learn to decode a word, to recognize and name three-dimensional shapes, to participate in an engaging science exploration when their brains and bodies are ready to fight, to run away, or to freeze. It's only through the safety of a nurturing relationship with a trusted adult that trauma-impacted children can regulate their emotions and behaviors and participate productively in the classroom community. As we move forward, it's important to remember this. Supporting children and families who've been impacted by trauma is hard. It is impossibly hard sometimes. So hard. There will be days where you feel emotionally and mentally and physically overwhelmed. This is particularly true if you yourself experienced early adversity. And unfortunately, we know all too well that some children will experience awful things, terrible things. And as much as we want to, we can't prevent that. As much as we want to, we alone can't save and rescue all of them. But here's what we can do. We can love, we can nurture, we can put intentional effort into ensuring that our responses to these children do not re-traumatize them. We can seek to understand the reason behind their behavior. We can respond with empathy and intentionality. We can find empathy for families. We can practice self-care so that we can be our best selves for our students and for the other people in our lives. We can learn and we can share what we've learned as advocates for relationship-centered teaching. We can share our stories in an effort to normalize talking about trauma and provide comfort to others with shared experiences. We can even do this work well, and through our daily interactions can communicate that trauma does not define the student, the parent, the teacher, or the classroom. And we can provide a buffering relationship, one that mitigates the short and long-term impact of children's exposure to trauma and has the potential to forever change the trajectory of a trauma-impacted child's life. I thank you so much for your commitment to this work and to the children and families you serve. Please feel free to reach out to me at info@nonieeducationalsolutions.com, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.